I will keep it quite brief, actually, and share with you something I found very striking when I was researching the laws of warfare in relation to military collecting. And that is actually how legalized the whole process of booty making was. And on that note, I want to set out how the extreme violence to people in the Dutch East Indies was actually sort of being cleansed or being sterilized by these legal procedures. It is important to note also that the practice of booty making was actually very old and very part of a military culture. But while in the 19th century in Europe it was slowly being banned, the East Indies legislation just shows something completely else. And it actually shows an increase of legislation, so decrees, ordinances, formal laws also, in which the taking of objects was being legitimized. And we see it here, for example, I cannot show the complete documents because it's very long, but in the legislation on prijs- en buitgelden, so that's booty, we see this whole list of formal procedures on how to handle booty. And what you see also is that they had to make this proces verbal, which is a formal report. And then also in the 20th century, the Dutch the colonial government added an ordinance, and it's quite an interesting document actually. But what it shows is that there are restrictions to the taking of booty, but that they have a very wide margin of appreciation. So you see it here. I try to highlight it, but it's not very clear. But that you see this one sentence of "as far as circumstances allow," which gives a very wide appreciation. Another relevant set of measures actually concerns the Batavian Society, and that institution, many of you will know it, but it was an institution that was also appointed by the Dutch government to collect objects, gifted objects from local rulers. In that mission was also extended to objects that were regarded as zegetekenen. So that's translated as victory signs, or as you see here, objects from enemy property that was taken. And well, these pieces of legislation, together also with archival materials and the minutes, for example, of the Batavian Society, show how deeply involved this institution also was in the distribution of objects. For example, the proces verbal, the formal report I just showed, was drawn up after the Batavian Society also made a selection of objects. And what you see in that whole process is that there unfolds this pact between the army, the legislator, and also museum people. And in that regard, I actually want to emphasize two processes. First, this idea of having the law on your side and the bureaucratic tone of all those documents, in which the violence is sort of disguised or morphed into decrees, in which you have these words which indicate a sense of, well, sometimes pride, but also a sense of worthiness, of protection. And there's this, what you also see, there becomes this sort of machinery of making necessary procedures, so of making the formal reports. And in that sense, you see how it demonstrates that legal procedures were deployed to sterilize or to clean the violence and the destructions brought to people and their objects. And the second, little bit that. But the second process I want to emphasize is the involvement of many colonial agents. And we see one here on the screen, I think, which is familiar to many of you. But this is Lindor Serrurier. He was the director also of this museum from 1880 till 1896. And in that capacity, he was actually highly aware of all the legislation in the East Indies. He knew more about it than the indexes say about it. But what you see is also in the archives is that he was corresponding very intensively with all sorts of ministers, so ministers of foreign affairs, of colonial affairs, and we see it here in two of his letters from around 1890. And in the first one, he complains about the distribution of objects from the society. So he stresses that the scientific interests are best served in the museum in Leiden, and that those interests should be taken into account and also prevail above the feelings of the Batavian society. And in the second one, he's loosely notified the ministers of the territories that were still missing from the collection and that he was highly interested in to collect. So to conclude, I believe that these two processes of having the law on your side and of all those involvements actually they facilitated a sort of climate in which it was normal to take objects from people in colonial territories. And in that context, the law also strengthened this process in which violence could be separated and could be sterilized. It separated violence from the people, the Indonesian humans who were actually affected by Dutch colonial aggression and who fell victim to destruction and whose objects could be targeted, shipped, listed, and subsequently stored and exhibited.
In my presentation, I will focus on the practices in the museum, and I will look more specifically at the years around 1900, 1910. And I would like to rephrase Elsbeth's statement about colonial laws and apply it to the unwritten laws of Dutch museum practice of around, say, 1900. Museum procedures and practices were deployed to cleanse or sterilize the destruction brought to humans and their objects. It is my conviction that it is time to reveal and expose the museum's historical and bureaucratic acts of cleansing and sterilization. And I suggest to do this by focusing on the intimate intertwining of ethnographic collections in Dutch museums and the extremely violent military colonial practice in which some of these collections, and I would like to emphasize not all, are rooted. And as a result of this conviction, I would like to propose a redraft of the question as was put forward in the invitation for this meeting. And first I will read the question which is in the invitation. It says, how can we acknowledge these exhibiting histories without replicating the violence and problematic discourses which are often associated with them? And as you can see, my proposal would actually be, how can we acknowledge these exhibition histories, and I would like to add the histories of colonial collecting, and de-sterilize the violence associated with them. To explore this last question, I have launched a, for the time being, highly informal research project under the working title Pax Neerlandica Moordgeschiedenis. And in concept, this project has the aim to be a collaborative project that wants to infiltrate on friendly terms and in close dialogue a consortium of museums and institutions in the Netherlands and abroad. The project focuses, as I said, on the period 1900-1910 in Indonesia, 10 years of, and I quote Petra Groen's characterization, feverish Dutch imperialism that resulted in a series of colonial wars of conquest on the edges of the Dutch East Indies. During these years, an estimate of 70,000 Indonesians were deadly victims of Dutch aggression. In the very same year, thousands of objects coming directly from Indonesian killing fields were included in Dutch museums through the intervention of the same military officers that were involved in the killings. These years were coined as the heydays of colonial collecting. In the museum, these objects were willfully neutralized and sterilized into exclusively ethnographic collections, radically detached from the state of violence in which the collecting of these objects took root. Colonial collections, in my view, became vanishing points of colonial violence. And the project Pax Neerlandica Moordgeschiedenis is an attempt to mark, not to undo, this disappearance, and to see if it is possible to put something in the place of the void, the absence. So the project in the making, it wants to use documentary and artistic means to do this, to mark the disappearance of violence. And this is the target of the documentary approach based on historical research. It is about mapping and identifying hundreds of ethnographical objects, photographs, and documents in museums in the Netherlands and elsewhere, and bring them together and approach them as traces of violence, evidences of violence. And by doing so, it wants to offer the possibility of looking into the murky mirror of Dutch colonialism and antique museum practices.
I'd like to use this opportunity to look at a specific case study from my research to hopefully open up broader questions related to the display of colonial collections. And I think we've already heard a number of very stimulating propositions this morning and questions, so I think I'll try to draw from that as well. So I'll talk about the way the collections acquired by Dutch Protestant missionaries in Western New Guinea have been displayed in various settings and throughout time, and how, from this specific case study, we can think today of their possible display. In this presentation, I'll look into the mode of display through which some of these items were exhibited, focusing on three main modes. So first, how some of these collections were exhibited within a museum setting, then how they were exhibited as part of a missionary touring exhibition, and finally, how the mission also contributed to some displays in colonial and universal exhibitions. So far, I've not managed to find photographs that would show how this UZV collection would have been displayed in the museum in Rotterdam. However, I found this photograph, which is actually quite well known, that dates back to the end of 1903, so 3 years before the acquisition of the UZV collection, and which shows one of the new cabinets at the time in the museum, which displayed some of the earliest collections from the northern coast of Dutch New Guinea. So one can therefore imagine that the UZV collection would have been displayed in a similar fashion. And commenting on this display, the annual report of the Rotterdam Museum explains that next to this cabinet, another showcase displayed photographs, maps, text, in order to contextualize the objects, and that overall a geographical layout should be prescribed, while insisting on the aesthetic dimension, we even say the elegance of the display. And so the UZV director, when talking about the transfer of their collection to Rotterdam, also really thought about that and really considered that the objects would be better displayed in Rotterdam and benefit from a better visibility, because also it's important to keep in mind that the Mission Museum in Utrecht had very, very few visitors. In the reports, sometimes they just mention 30 visitors in 1 year. So it's also very minimal. So they were hoping that benefiting from this bigger exposure in a bigger museum, this would in turn also support the missionary work. So with this transfer from the Mission Museum to the Ethnographic Museum, the UZV collection was integrated into the Rotterdam Museum's framework. So the mission, history, and context of acquisition were silenced, if not erased, and the objects ended up displayed as any other ethnographic objects, according to the classification established by the museum in Rotterdam, so by typology or use. And these categories are actually listed in the list that I showed before that shows the transfer of the collection. So categories such as food or clothing and body adornments, architecture, agriculture, weapons, music, dance, but also religion, education. So it's interesting to note the kind of discourse, again, that framed the display of these objects. So all the objects lent by the UZV were part of what has been termed like Group 2 in the catalogue of the colonial exhibition. So Group 2 dealt with the indigenous population of the territories, according to a number of categories like their homes and way of living, their food and means of subsistence, their arts and sciences, games and recreation, customs and traditions, forms of government, courts of law, religions and religious customs. And so they were divided in a number of classes. But what was really interesting is that they were incorporated into this framework, and that the idea was really that the exhibition was designed to provide an opportunity for visitors to compare the different customs of inhabitants of their different colonies. So this ethnographic section, like the Group 2, was the largest and most important part of the colonial exhibition. And it was really intended to provide a systematic and comprehensive picture of the extent, nature, and specific features of the indigenous population of the Dutch East Indies. So there was really this comparative evolutionary narrative within which the UZV collection was reframed. It wasn't presented in order to illustrate the work of a mission or anything more specifically as to how they were acquired, but really to disseminate knowledge about the colonies and make the Dutch and international public more aware about it to justify the colonial endeavor. I don't really have the time to talk about it today, but then I just wanted to mention also that the UZV also contributed to exhibitions not only in the Netherlands but also abroad, and they did contribute a number of entries and objects to the Universal Exhibition in 1900s in Paris. So the UZV objects were then, as I said, kind of integrated in a different type of discourse, in another type of presentation. And the idea was really to see how throughout these different types of exhibition, they have been reframed and mobilized in different ways. And finally, and to kind of link more with what we try to kind of discuss today, and how, this kind of specific case study and histories can teach us, or how we can think with it productively, I'd like to ask a few questions and see how we can, open up the discussion to current questions relating to the exhibition of such collections today. So, during the kind of 4 pivotal decades I've been working on, from between the 1880s and 1920s, these collections and the display were mobilized to illustrate and justify missionary and conversion endeavors, but also to justify evolutionary discourses supporting the Dutch and international colonial project. But later on, they will also be reframed as art, as Papuan heritage, as many other things. So how do we want to mobilize these collections today, and what kind of stories do we want to tell by exhibiting them? I'd like to ask also, how do we acknowledge other voices, and in particular Papuan voices, as Bono was saying, try to also engage with organizing a number of museum visits, try to share this knowledge, but it's also, there's still so much more to do. And also, how do we acknowledge these other voices amidst this kind of loudness, this kind of very cumbersome baggage in a way? So I've kind of, listed a few questions. I think they were also in the program, so I think we can just leave that here and take them with us for the rest of the day. Thank you.
When the Autry Museum merged with the Southwest Museum in 2003, the Native American collection at the Autry went from being a few thousand works to over 230,000 works, one of the largest Native American collections in the United States outside of the Smithsonian. In 2022, we opened the Resources Center that houses the collection and works as a place for community engagement. The Resources Center is about 15 minutes away from the Autry Museum. When it was built, careful planning went into ensuring the facility had places for community members. One of the spaces, affectionately called the community room, we're not very good at names, is a space where visitors can spend time with a collection item if needed. We accommodate the possibility of ceremonies inside the facility, which include a changing room as well as showers. In case visitors would like to smudge or have a ceremony outside, a ceremonial garden was created for those possibilities. A private and secure space allows for the possibility of bringing objects outdoors if needed for ceremonies. In some cases, community members feel the works need to breathe, so we can take them outside. With a collection in hand, a new facility, a new staff, the Autry's approach to work with Native communities also changed. In 1990, the U.S. government passed NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, a law that certainly provides Native Americans with basic human rights. For decades, Native American tribes have insisted that museums and institutions that receive federal funding return their human remains, which we'll call ancestors, the grave goods, commonly known as associated funerary objects and unassociated funerary objects, their sacred and ceremonial objects, and their works of cultural patrimony. As we know, many of these works and ancestors were collected from Native communities in ways that would be illegal in the United States today. NAGPRA, 1990, that's when it was passed, can be broken down into a few components. First, by the way, in the spirit of full disclosure, I am not a lawyer, all right? First, it insisted that institutions that have collections and receive federal funding create inventories of their Native collections and send these inventories, a process known as notifications, to the relevant tribes. The next step is that if tribes want to claim any items that fall within the above categories, they work with the institution to bring those back. Lastly, the law provided a timeline for museums to complete this work. NAGPRA 1990 was a great step in providing Native communities some agency in determining the cultural materials, the future of their ancestors, but it wasn't enough. Under NAGPRA 1990, museums still had the power to determine what was sacred, what could be returned, and what could be displayed. Native communities had to prove that their cultural materials actually belonged to them. Ironically, Native traditional methods of knowledge were not considered legitimate sources in the 1990 legislation, but academic journals and notes created by non-Native researchers were the gold standard in providing evidence of ownership and use. The other challenge to NAGPRA 1990 is that there was little enforcement of the law and the timeline was too slow. From the 1990 law to the new NAGPRA legislation, which was passed in January, a total of 34 years have elapsed, and many museums are still not compliant. Under the leadership of Pueblo Deb Haaland, the U.S. Secretary of Interior, 1990 NAGPRA was revisited. A year-long listening sessions were held across Indian country and in many institutions, and over 200 comments were gathered. The new NAGPRA rules provided more agency to Native people. For those that may have heard in the U.S. news, once the 2024 NAGPRA came into effect, which came into effect January 12th, many museums covered display cases in their museum galleries. The media hubbub sensationalized the real issue. Museums should have been working with Native communities from the very beginning and all along. Collaborative relationships between museums and Native communities can only result in positive relationship building, accurate interpretation for the visitor, and full transparency between the two parties. There are a few important changes in the new repatriation law that is worth noting. In the past, the museum, in consultation with the Native community, made the determination of what is repatriatable. The new law made the following change. Anthropological records and the like can be a source when this determination is made. However, Native traditional knowledge is the final factor. Secondly, tribes have the option of determining research protocols regarding their cultural knowledge. Unfettered access to cultural knowledge by non-Native researchers in collections, libraries, and archives is no longer automatically granted. If tribes request that they be involved in determining who has access to their cultural material in collections and research, it is their right under the new law. Thirdly, cultural items, which can be defined in a number of ways, defined by the tribes, cannot be exhibited or displayed without tribal consent. The last important change that I feel is worth noting here is that it sets a very specific timetable for actionable items to be completed by the museum. How can this be done? I'd like to provide you with some examples that we do at the Autry Museum before the 2024 NAGPRA law was enacted. With the merger of the Southwest Collection, we created a very specific internal policies that addresses components of the new law. The first is a Native collection policy, which was approved by our board last year and requires that we prioritize access to Native community members. Secondly, we take the philosophy that we are stewards of the collection and look to Native communities for guidance on how to conserve, interpret, and care for their cultural items. Our repatriation team, which consists of 5 full-time employees, works collaboratively with Native folks, both federally and non-federally recognized. Our collection access policy stipulates that for many items and research materials, researchers must get a letter of approval from the tribe. With this letter, full transparency is achieved at several levels. We feel that Native voice and concerns are at the forefront of our work, and our policies and actionable items reflect that philosophy. Although for some institutions, NAGPRA can be challenging, especially because it's the new law, but it doesn't have to be. Approaching the topic from a view as being a steward of the collection and a resource, community collaboration is not only good for the museum, the Native community, but also for the collection items. They are lonely and want to be visited by their people. Thank you.
So museums tell stories, and of course these stories always have multiple perspectives, whether they are in a physical space or in a virtual space. And I think what we want to explore is how we can make these stories meaningful and also share different perspectives. And these virtual stories are often, of course, based on data that is in databases. And just as we have been seeing in the physical museums, we can also ask what actually is in the databases, in the digital databases. So what voices are we missing? So when we think about decolonizing the museum or thinking about post-colonial museums, we should also think about decolonizing the database. So our work as computer scientists is also to look at that part. So what we are interested in the Pressing Matter project, and me and Sarah, is 3 things about these multiple perspectives in data. So one is, how do we get it? How do we get multiple perspectives if they are not there? 2, how do we represent it? And 3, if we have it, how do we actually show it to different visitors, virtual or real visitors. So we've been doing several experiments and mini projects. One, for example, doing crowdsourcing to figure out how can we actually get perspectives from multiple people with multiple backgrounds. So this is work with students, Jordan and Naomi. So Naomi has been looking at how can we actually get voices that were previously unheard, for example, from people in rural northern Ghana about objects in the World Museum's collection. So that's, I think, very exciting. This is still running, so we don't know yet what they think, but we will. So if we have those voices, then we need to think about how do we get them into the data, and are the databases set up to cater to this? Or are there restrictions, technical restrictions, that are food for thought for people like me? So we've been working on that, and I think Sarah is doing great work on that to represent, for example, multiple perspectives on provenance, but also on object descriptions. So that's, again, ongoing work. And then if we have those, how do we present it? And I think that's where we get in also connect to Shengwi's talk. So one preliminary research that we've been doing at Vrije Universiteit together with Thilo Hartman, who's a professor in virtual reality, he's a psychologist by training, is to think about, can we actually set up exhibitions that invoke a sense of polyfocality, some realization of multiple perspectives in the visitor. So we had a sort of small experimental VR application around the flag of Suriname, which is an object that's here, but also exists in a virtual form. And we built a virtual reality environment around that focuses on showing different perspectives on, for example, the flag and the different colors and the history of Suriname. And then we ask before and after people's perspectives, and indeed, right, then the psychologists come in, and then we can actually measure that people indeed have more appreciation for these multiple perspectives. So that's sort of the effect on the visitor. So that's what we've been doing, and now with Shengwi, we have actually a follow-up project which is about doing this at scale. So we'll have a PhD project in the Hybrid Intelligence Project, which is a Dutch AI project, where we will look at these kind of techniques to see if we can actually get information from people. So not just present it, but actually have a more meaningful interaction with people.
We have been doing this work jointly with Rembrandt House and the Leiden University, trying to explore diversities in the VR environment. And this work is basically inspired by the real physical exhibition at the Rembrandt House, which was held in 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic, which was also mentioned earlier this morning. So as the director said, this is really a powerful statement about Black presence and representation in the Netherlands, about being better looking and blind spots, about having a voice and a changing image. So in this physical exhibition, they basically represent the Black people in Dutch art. They try to present the Black people to beat the commonly seen stereotypical portrayals of Black people in the 17th century at Rembrandt's time, and also modern art. So of course, this is in the context of decolonization. You know much better than I do. And also contribute to the polyvocality, trying to bring different voices out of their own collection. From museum point of view, they also want to see what kind of impact this has in the audience, especially for young people. However, as I said, it is really in the middle of pandemic. There's not many people could actually visit this beautiful exhibition. So the very original idea was just to use a VR to build a digital version of it, to preserve it, because we have people have spent so much time to design, organize it. So we collaborate with Rembrandt House, selected 19 paintings from the original physical exhibition, put in those 3 virtual rooms. So it is developed in Unity, that basically people can put on the headset and get into the virtual world and walk within these 3 rooms and see what's going on. Since it is in the virtual world, in the VR headset, you are very much monitored. So we know where you're looking at, and where you know where you are. So actually you can really see your interests are. So this is one of the things that we are, can offer. So in terms of building this kind of agent, virtual agent, we need to identify the personal interest. So a lot of ways we can do is trying to track the behaviors in the virtual environment, and machine learning definitely can help us to find out that. Once you find out the interest, how to adapt it to this particular user on the spot, how to then generate a dynamic content, how to present the polyvocal representation, which one of them, and provided that you have got it, so hopefully you help us to find this polyvocal representation. We hope that we can build this kind of interactive dialogue that can gradually get into your interest and gradually deliver the knowledge about what you are looking for. Another important component in this figure system is how to ensure the curator's message is kind of properly delivered, because they spend a lot of time and they have a beautiful idea to collect all these paintings and collectively deliver some message. We want to make sure providing a personalized service is nice, but the museum's own job is still trying to deliver something useful. So we have to find the balance between these two. You have to do the consistency checking whether the agent says something museum guys agree with. Some kind of feedback loops trying to see what kind of impact this agent has for the visit. Talking about that, you have to really get the user of the museum or visitors of the museums into the figure. So I talked about social VR in the beginning. So we are really exploring new possibilities with the social VR. As I said, social VR, people can come from different locations and in discussing things together. So in the VR, with Avatar, basically you can replicate what you do and the facial expressions and speech, data, everything. So the communication seems to be okay, can be enhanced in this way. We really see this can be the place we can provide or facilitate the cross-cultural dialogue. Imagine that people from Dutch schools and people from Curacao, and they can come into the Curacao exhibition together virtually, and then they found objects taboo and taboos. They discuss things about it. So in this way, the different opinions will come out, different argumentations come out. This could be to us, for a computer scientist, a really fantastic platform to collect data. So in order to analyze how the human communicate with each other on these very sensitive topics. And also, hopefully, we can build the virtual agents or virtual moderators to moderate such communication in the future.
The kind of core, I suppose, research question that motivated this project at the very beginning for me was the idea of what does it look like to envision the hurma of the body, of human remains in particular, in museum collections? So to explain this idea really quickly, it's sort of it's a difficult one to sort of translate into English. Really, it's prevalent in Arabic-speaking parts of the world, most specifically, and in the Islamic world more broadly, although it is not specifically an Islamic concept. Really, it pertains to ideas about the dignity, autonomy, privacy, respect of the body, both human bodies in particular, living and dead. And so within this kind of concept of ideas, within this kind of constellation of ideas, we see, for example, if you do archival research, it emerges or has been prevalent when it comes to conversations about how do we engage with, for example, with tombs or with grave goods or with these kind of sacred sort of sites. If you look at it in English or Western language discourses, you'll see a lot of conversations around For example, medical ethics, organ donation, or in the legal context, things like, for example, like corporal punishment. You won't tend to see a lot of scholarly writing in English, for example, around like the intersection between this idea and like the museological context, although this is work I'm kind of currently developing a bit. Although, if you look at it in Arabic language discourses, you'll see a lot of, for example, media discourses around the work that museums are doing now. It's not like just this historical idea in the past. There are a lot of really contemporary active engagements with it. When it comes to, for example, in the Egyptian context, which is mine and the one I'm most familiar with, mummies, for example, like this really major touchstone for museums and like collections of human remains. So the first part of this project was this performance that it was about a month ago. It took place at the World Museum Amsterdam. And this was the one where I really tried to tackle the zoomed out kind of broad level view of the collection overall. How is it that we envision the kind of the ethical demands or questions that are posed by these collections of human remains? And so I didn't really explain this like over the course of the performance. I left it up to interpretation a little bit, but the other thing that was playing is kind of a two-channel sort of thing going on, was this AR data visualization of, as I said, all of this textual information relating to all the human remains in the World Museum collection. And so this AR visualization is placed right behind it's basically what you would be able to see looking out the window from where the performance is happening. And so the size of each of these columns represents one of these like data entities of human remains in the collection, and the height of the columns represents the amount of textual information in the collection about each of them. And so in some cases you'll see there's quite a lot, and then in many, many cases it's just absolutely nothing. That's like the sort of holes in the ground, the absence is there. And so then over the course of this video, it's like you could see like kind of traversing the entirety of the park because it's just so many. It's like it really gives you a sense of, again, the scope of how many of these entities there are. And it's also to act as a kind of an in-place sort of memorial, maybe, a way of marking, as Wayne had said, not just a semblance of the bodies themselves, but of the extraction or the lack thereof of information from these bodies, as it's happened over time. And in some ways, like these absent spaces become almost kind of like grave sites, like in the ground, which again was literally a graveyard some time back. For me, the questions are, what does it look like? So thinking through visual languages, what does it look like to try to restore these modes of dignity, autonomy, privacy, respect to the body? Some of you have already mentioned other modes of other contemporary art projects that strive to do this. I would love to hear any other reference points you may have, but it doesn't have to be through the language of contemporary art. Maybe it's other kind of modes of access or utilization that you feel have really successfully done this. And what does that look like? What kinds of visual languages have managed to enact that in your view? And then also, for me, another thing that's quite important is because I try to prioritize like the kind of the hands-on, the actual sort of doing of the work of restoration, repair, rehumanization, perhaps in Serge Schul's sense, is what kinds of projects for you have, I guess, largely through contemporary art, have done this, have really managed to enact this performatively or literally, like really staged effective interventions of reimagining or intervening upon human remains in museums along these lines. And also any other thoughts or feedback would be more than welcome. Thank you so much.